So Andrew Kung and Emanuel Hahn, they're both New York-based photographers. They met in 2017. Besides sharing the same profession as being photographers, they also found that they had business school degrees and experience working in tech startups. But that's not what they're here about today. They did develop a friendship, and their friendship went into discussions about how the Asian race is perceived in America, along with Andrew's own parents' love story about their meeting down south, led them to collaborate on a photojournalism project. It's called the Mississippi Delta Chinese, and it was recently showcased in the New York Times. Andrew and Emanuel, welcome. Thanks for coming on our show.
Thanks for having us.
So tell us a little bit about this project that you're doing. It was basically featuring Chinese who are more than one generation here, who are basically in the Mississippi Delta. They have Southern accents. They're working in small towns. Tell us how this all started, this whole conversation started, and how you got interested in all this.
I think the initial vision on how this project first started was us both sitting at Emanuel's apartment in Brooklyn Heights here in New York, and we were both talking about our commercial and editorial work and how that has been kind of repetitive lately. And so we wanted to work on a more meaningful project. And so along those lines, I was always like, yeah, I've always wanted to shoot Southern landscapes. There's a certain beauty and charm in that as a photographer. And at the same time, delving a little deeper into like Emanuel's interests in the diaspora of Asian American communities or Asian communities, and myself, my parents having met in North Carolina, I've always been curious about what that experience was like. And so Emanuel is almost like, oh, why don't we do a project about Asians in the deep rural South?
Did you know anything about that history?
Very minimally. We didn't know too much in detail. We didn't really know they existed in the deep rural South until we started doing tons of research, reached out to about 50 to 75 Asian American organizations just to get a clearer sense of like what different pockets they might exist in. And one person responded and was like, oh, I heard about this lady who did this video documentary down there. You should connect with her.
That was down on the Mississippi Delta.
Yep, that's right. And then simultaneously, we saw an NPR article about the community a few years back. And so coupling that together, we were like, oh, I think we have something here.
So what was the focus of your project? Just showing that there's Asian Americans in the South, or showing their struggles?
Yeah, I think a big part of the project was, just documenting the daily lives of the Chinese community in the Mississippi Delta, but also kind of understanding the history of the people that have lived there. The Chinese community in the Mississippi Delta have lived there for over 100 years. And, we don't know anything about it, until recently. And I think we were just very curious in terms of all the different aspects.
What was the reasoning for them moving to the Mississippi Delta? This is
it
in the
was
1850s, right around,
that's right.
right after the end of the Civil War or during the Civil War era?
That's right. So a lot of the Chinese were kind of enticed by these people who promised them better work opportunities. But essentially, they were indentured laborers that were moved to the Mississippi Delta to work in the farms. And
so basically, they were brought in as plantation workers.
Exactly. Yeah. And then very soon they realized they couldn't make good money doing that.
What was the difference between, say, the Chinese who you said they were indentured servants versus the black slaves? How were they treated differently?
As far as I understand it, the Chinese were still paid a wage. It was just a very, very low wage. They were not kind of slaves or they were not kind of discriminated to the extent that black people were. So when a lot of these Chinese people, for example, they were able to start grocery stores, they were able to start small businesses. So, they weren't granted full privileges, obviously, but they had it a little bit easier than the black people who were living there at that time. And there are a lot of the Chinese people found opportunities to start grocery stores and other small businesses to serve the local community.
Were there any laws that you knew of that were on the books at the time in the South? Because this is right around the time when the North won the Civil War. The slaves were, in words only, were freed. We didn't have a civil rights movement for another 100 years after that. But what laws were on the books that were enshrined in law that kind of segregated the Chinese and the Asians down south? Did you find out about any of that?
Yeah, we knew the Chinese Exclusion Act was in place that prevented Chinese people from entering the country.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first immigration law ever passed. I don't know if you
That's
know that
correct.
or not.
That's correct,
there
yeah.
was no immigration laws ever in the United States. The first one was to exclude the Chinese, and that was in around 1880, and it
That's
was
right.
never. And basically, what it did was, if you were Chinese and in the United States of America, yes, you lived here, but there was no additional immigration from China. There was a lot of immigration from Europe. A lot of Europeans came, Italians, Irish, Jews in the 1900s, but it wasn't early 1900s. But it wasn't until 1943 that they signed off on eliminating the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was really because China was helping the United States in World War II.
Right,
That's everything I know.
yeah.
I've now told you everything I know.
That's absolutely true. And now that's everything that we know as well.
So the Chinese were segregated down south. Okay, it was a white privileged time and era for over 100 years there. How were they segregated? How did they live?
It was kind of different depending on which town you went to. Some local white communities were more favorable towards Chinese community in certain towns, and certain towns weren't. And I think the main difference really between the treatment came down to how many Chinese people were in each town. Whereas in a town where maybe if there were only one or two Chinese families, then the white community wouldn't treat them as badly, but tried to integrate them into their community. So that was something that was interesting that we observed.
It's something that's even interesting that theme even goes into today when you see, especially the white population being threatened by immigrants, minorities, Asians, blacks, Spanish, and the more they feel threatened, the more anti-immigrant they become. And here, even 150 years ago, one or two Asians in a town can't threaten the majority population, but maybe a larger one, at least perception-wise, not in reality, but in perception-wise, may seem at least perceived to be threatening.
That's right. Yeah. I think that also kind of, in practice, what that meant was for certain towns, there were Chinese communities that were not allowed to buy property where it was a majority white town. So a lot of the Chinese families ended up building a house behind their grocery stores. And so they literally lived where they worked.
Who did they serve? I mean, especially in towns where, maybe the Chinese were being discriminated against, they weren't allowed to buy property, probably didn't go to the same schools as the white children. They opened a grocery store. Who was walking into the grocery store?
Yeah, the grocery stores were mainly catered towards Black people because back then with segregation, white people wouldn't serve Black people. So the Chinese found this opportunity to provide daily essentials and necessities to the Black community.
So when did this all change?
I would say it changed gradually, but I think the biggest kind of marker or the biggest kind of landmark was when the Civil Rights Act passed. And I think that was just kind of a sweeping kind of time of reform where because the tide was turning and there was all this momentum, Chinese people were more integrated into the different societies and communities that they lived in.
It's very interesting that you say that, because when you hear the civil rights movement, you think about trying to make blacks equal in America, and trying to eliminate the discriminatory laws and that were put in place to keep blacks down, but it also kept other minorities down as well. And here we're listening to about how the civil rights era laws changed the lives of Chinese in America.
That's exactly right. So the Chinese community definitely benefited a lot from the Black community's struggles against discrimination. I guess with the whole Civil Rights Act that passed, it was not just the Black people that benefited, but I guess every other minority in the States.
So are these grocery stores still in business now down in Mississippi?
Yeah, so a few of them are still around. There aren't that many. I think there's maybe like one or two at most in each city, and so very, very sparse. But I think at its peak, there were even 2 to 3 grocery stores on the same block, serving different kind of pockets of communities within that one block.
Now, when you went down there, I guess it would be a weird experience to see Chinese people of Chinese ancestors speaking with a very thick Southern accent.
There was very strict segregation. The whites were in power, the blacks definitely out of power, and then the Chinese were just kind of in the middle.
How did you react when you heard them talk, or how do outsiders react when you heard them talk?
Yeah, I think that was a big shock for us, because if you really close your eyes and just heard them talk, you wouldn't really guess it's, an old Asian lady. That when you reference her picture and you hear her talking, you're like, yeah, that doesn't add up. But I think at the same time, that almost adds to kind of like the charm of the community and the people. in the Mississippi Delta, just seeing such a wide range and diversity of people throughout, not just in large urban cities, but in pockets like the Mississippi Delta.
What impressed you? I assume these people are, I mean, people who are living there generation after generation. Tell me how they've impressed you.
I think a broader way is just like the overall theme of perseverance over time. I think from times of having to open grocery stores, work super hard to support their entire families, to present day impressing me, or at least us, in terms of the community and the level of community that they had in the Delta, in the sense that all the families and all their friends have, weekly potlucks and get-togethers. And as Asian Americans living in large urban cities, sometimes it's easy to forget that community aspect that we have here and kind of take that for granted. So I think those are two of the big ways they surprised me. One, the perseverance over time, and I think two is the level of community that remains to this day.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. They probably, I would presume, have melded a bit of Southern culture and Chinese culture together, and it's very unique to go there. What is your, one of your favorite stories, or some of your favorite stories about your travels through the Mississippi Delta, taking pictures and documenting all this?
I mean, the wide open space in Mississippi is just something that we were not used to, and we're just driving for hours, and there were all these, beautiful cotton fields on the left and the right. I mean, that's definitely memorable. We had one of the people that we meet who works for the Department of Agriculture. He invited us onto one of the cotton fields, and we got to go on a cotton picker machine that went up and down. And, we just have very little conception of how farms are run, or how we get our goods, or where we get our food from, and just being on the field. It was just kind of like a very special moment for us. The other thing was really when one of the Chinese families that we met cooked a meal for us. And it wasn't just like a simple meal, it was this kind of feast, and they invited their friends and their families. And we felt like we were right at home, even though we were in the Mississippi and far from home. And they really made us feel like welcomed, and the Southern hospitality is real. Like everyone that we met, they were so nice to us. When we initially went, we had no idea what the experience would be like. And when we got there, it was just, they made it so easy for us. And we didn't really have to try that hard at that point.
How long did this whole project take you?
This whole project from beginning to end, as in from conception to being published, took about 9 months.
Wow. Yeah.
But the time that we spent in the Mississippi was 1 week.
So what do you want people to take away from all of this? What should everyone's takeaway be from all of this? What do you want people's long-lasting impressions to be of all of this work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us as Asian American storytellers, we really want to kind of present very different types of Asian American stories. We kind of want to break this very standard narrative of the model minority, which is the main kind of storyline for every Asian American story that's told in the United States. And it goes something like, you come from a poor country, you work hard, you go to an Ivy League school, and you have a really good job somewhere, some corporate job. And that is the definition of success for Asian Americans, or even just like any new Americans, right? Like we like to tout this idea of the American dream, but it tends to be something that's very one-dimensional. And what we wanted to show is that there are so many different varied experiences that Asian Americans have. You have Asian Americans in the cities, but then you also have Asian Americans in the rural South, and their experience, is not inferior in any way. They have lived very rich lives. It's full of love. It's full of community. They've given back to their communities as well. Some of these Chinese people became mayors in their towns. They're very engaged civically and within their communities. And I think we just kind of want to raise these examples to show the rest of the country that an Asian American story doesn't have to be told in one way. Asian American as a term encompasses so many different cultures, so many different countries and backgrounds. Asia itself is, a huge area with so many different types of people. And I think in the media in the US, it tends to be portrayed as this one thing. Our goal as Asian Americans is to show that diversity in America. And the final thing really is, I think through storytelling, we just want to build empathy for different types of people. Hopefully, if you're a person in the South and you've seen the story in the New York Times and you've heard these people, you'll realize that they're not that different from you. There are people who enjoy hunting, fishing. There are people who work in farming. There are people who talk like you. So we're all not that different. And hopefully that can lead to greater tolerance.
It's amazing that when people get to know each other, they realize they have a lot more in common than they have not in common. Now, I saw the pictures in the New York Times. They were awesome. They were fantastic. Do you have any favorite one?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the photo of the two brothers, the Kwan brothers, so Ryan and Sean, and they're just sitting outside of their family's grocery store. Just something about the way they're positioned and their expression.
Right.
It just, that's my personal favorite.
So besides the New York Times, I guess you can Google this Mississippi Delta Chinese New York Times and see the photos. Where else can someone see these photos or this exhibit, or where can we see all of this?
Yeah, so online you can go to thedeltachinese.com, and that has all the photos and the audio components, so you can listen to how people sound. If you're in New York, we have an exhibition that's running right now until July 7th, and that's at the Pearl River Mart down on Broadway near Chinatown. And that'll be for another month and a half. So if you want to see the photos in real life, you can do that. If you want to see it online, you can go to thedeltachinese.com.
That's fantastic. Are you guys going to work together again?
Yeah, we're actually here working on our next project.
Can you share it with us, or it's a secret?
It's a secret for now.
It's a secret for now. All right, well, we'll look forward to it.
Working hard, yep.
All right, well, Andrew Kung and Emanuel Hahn, thank you very much for coming on our show. It's fantastic, beautiful work that you did, and very well spoken to both of you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Okay. Have a good one.